Welcome to Pink Kink,
where we talk about the pretty, twisted side of kink.
I'm Princess Rara.
And I'm Dara, the Electro Khaleesi.
Whether you are a new kinkster or have years of experience, Pink Kink will help you level up your kink knowledge.
Join us on this journey as we talk about our personal experiences and use the knowledge we've gained over 28 years of being involved in both private and professional aspects of this lifestyle to help you explore every facet of kink.
Get set for an adventure. Not only will you learn and grow, but we promise loads of laughter, turning each episode into a fun party. So fasten your seatbelt and let's get this show started. Pink Kink runs off the generosity of our devoted patrons.
As a patron, you will become a member of our special Discord server, receive some adorable Pink Kink stickers, as well as have access to a monthly behind-the-scenes podcast. Patrons also get discounts at our Etsy shop, Pink Kink Boutique, and our online classes at Pink Kink Institute.
In addition, our impactful and electrifying Pink Kinksters get special audio and video episodes. And finally, patrons at our highest tier will be recognized as producers, both here on the podcast and on our website.
If you would like to become a patron, you can visit us at patreon.com/pinkkinkpodcast or click the link at pinkkinkpodcast.com.
Today's episode is produced by our electrifying Pink Kinksters. Thank you, Jay, Witcherman, Brianna Lynn, Daddy J, Fabe, Embers, Blossom, William P, Claire, Lady Blooding, Naughty and Nice, Butte Pain, Manda Panda, Kat, Stefan, Shadow Phoenix, Kilted Sir, Brian, May Cry Devil, Ruby Riot, Mistress Velma, Enchanted Sparrow, The Wombat, Impact Hazard, Twitch, The Midnight Girl, Sinful, J21, Daisy If You Do, AK Harley Chick, Violet Rain, Serenity, Belle, Eric, Lady Affliction,
Dr. Dave, Pumpkin Pie, Ms. Tourmaline, S'more, Hacksaw, Wee Mad Beastie, To Be Better For Me, 3 a.m. Thoughts, Forrest, BP Bryn, Crash Override, Iro, Kinky Bear, Sviper No Swiping, Barbie, Navigator Bard, Frost, Sinful and Naughty, Coffee and Chaos, Noir, Haley's Comment, Mr. Pillsbury, Stitch, Peaches, Mighty Owl, Princess Sassy Pants, Lady and Lex, Chaos Monster, Casper, Hazel Page, Jessa Lady, DJ Harlow, Ophelia, Master A, and Drew.
So I know we normally start off episodes with shticks.
What's our shtick today?
But our last episode shtick took up half the damn episode.
Literally.
So I feel like maybe we should be a little shtickless.
Shtickless?
You know I like to make up words. Do you? But you understood what I mean.
I mean, yeah, but I don't understand why.
Well, just because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot to talk about in this episode because it's not going to be just the two of us.
We have a guest. And this is a guest we've already had.
Yes.
And we like this guest.
She's wonderful. Well, let me start off by talking about what inspired this particular episode.
So here's the shtick.
So I have a friend. Well, they're Dara's friend too. But I'm not going to give out any names because I haven't gotten permission to share exactly who this is, but I know that I'm okay sharing the story. And
I'm already sitting here so confused because I have no fucking idea.
And this episode was actually their suggestion. So this friend, unfortunately, had a very toxic relationship with the dominant and ended up with a scene that went terribly, terribly wrong and created a lot of trauma. And it's taken them a while to get back into kink and to be comfortable scening. And have had a couple of times of trying and having some like flashbacks and triggers and is slowly working to try to get past all of this. So their suggestion was to do an episode on how to come back from that. How do you come back from a kink trauma, be it a toxic relationship, a toxic dominant and abusive dominant, or I guess also submissive. You can also have toxic submissives and abusive submissives. What about a scene gone horribly wrong, even if it was not necessarily anybody's intentional fault, or a scene gone wrong because of consent violations and ignoring boundaries and all limits? Like, how do you recover from all of that? I mean, Dar and I could do some research and talk about it, but I really thought the best thing we needed to do was talk to a therapist about this, because this is a lot of emotional trauma and how to deal with that. And if we're going to talk to a therapist, we needed to talk to a therapist who understood kink, because it would be so much easier. So I reached out to a friend of the podcast, AJ Renard, who goes by she, her, who is an ASECT certified sex therapist and has been involved in the BDSM world her entire adult life, and said, hey, want to come talk to us about this pretty please? And thankfully she said yes. You've met AJ before. We had her on to talk about healthy hurting. So you know she knows her shit. But just in case you're one of those people who don't listen in order,
Boo on you.
and you're just starting later and you haven't gone back, let me read you her bio real quick, because it's pretty impressive. So I want to share it with you. As I said, AJ is an ASECT certified sex therapist and has a deep passion for teaching about the intersection of BDSM and mental health. She finds her happy place where there is rope, electricity, knives, boots, fear, and a lot of crying involved. And in her limited free time, she also makes custom chainmail for her shop, Foxy Feisty Redhead. AJ teaches a variety of classes about consent, negotiations, perspectives on DS, bottoming for intense scenes and edge play, mental health in BDSM, and behavioral science in power exchange dynamics. See, this is why we brought her in. Additionally, she often teaches about BDSM in non-kink spaces, hoping to destigmatize kink for therapists and medical professionals. She also loves demo bottoming for violet wand demos and things that make her shy in front of groups of people.
She's adorable.
She is adorable, and she knows her shit. I couldn't have, and when I knew we needed to talk to a therapist about this subject, she was the first person who came to mind, because she knows her shit. And as I said, being a kinkster herself and being a kinkster her whole entire adult life, though she does say she was a dark little thing far before that, she would understand. And I'm sure she's got stories and some amazingly terrific advice to help you. So let's bring on AJ.
You know, like 5 seconds ago, how you said we don't have a shtick?
Yeah, we had a shtick.
We have a shtick now.
Yeah.
You ready?
I'm ready.
You want to tell the story, or do you want me to tell the story?
You tell the story. It's,
All right.
it's audio. It's not. It's one of those things I don't control.
Oh, it's one of my shits. Okay. So we're on with the lovely AJ. Hi, AJ.
Hi.
Hello.
And we might have been having technical difficulties, which I, the genius that I am, totally MacGyvered the shit out of this whole system and made it work.
She's very proud of herself, and so she should be.
It was
I mean, that was a
amazing to
pretty good-
watch.
You liked having my boobs all up in the camera
It was
while I was trying
great.
to fix this situation? Yeah.
One time they came in from the side. It was amazing.
You got side boobs.
I know, like I got boobs entering from the right.
Oh, it's like a presentation where the slide slides in from the side.
Mhm.
So it was slide boob?
It was slide boob. Yes.
Oh,
Like
got it.
the wipe frame, but
Yes.
Except it with tit.
Listen, you can't really complain about that.
No, I mean they're still here, so you know, thank goodness. But holy shit, yeah, I had to maneuver a Bluetooth speaker onto my computer, which means we had to find where the pairing button was, because I've never seen this damn thing before, and Rara has no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm sitting there Googling, and then I pick up this thing, and I'm like, it's that button right there, which literally has the Bluetooth symbol on it. So I push it, we finally get this thing going, and then we had the lovely technical difficulty of reverb, where AJ could hear her through our speakers, and it was a hot mess, but I got it fixed.
We're solved. So
I fucking fixed it, man.
we can do this.
Yeah. I'm on a roll this week.
I know. Well, I'm so glad that you joined us today. I think there's a lot of people who have had kink-related trauma happen, unfortunately.
sure.
A lot of predators, just people, even if they're not predators, just, things go wrong in scenes.
Yeah, we do dangerous stuff.
Right?
Sometimes
people
it
gonna
goes
people.
sideways, and people are going to
People gonna people. And just, You can't exactly turn off your kinky side to say, oh, well, that's it. I'm done. I'm never going to do this again.
Mhm.
Well, people have tried, but it doesn't work out very well for them.
No. So I really wanted to be able to talk about how you come back from it. How do you come back and reclaim trust when things have just gone sideways,
Yeah.
Like my boobs.
like your boobs?
You did.
So I guess one of the first things is like, what are some of the more common types of kink trauma that you've encountered?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I would personally say the vast majority of trauma that I see in kink, or I should say a hefty majority of trauma that I see in kink, are things that might be grouped under kind of consent accidents, where something goes sideways, something goes wrong, something happens. Maybe there's, accident that happens during a scene. Maybe there's a miscommunication. Maybe there's an unknown boundary. Maybe somebody has a freeze response to trauma and the other person doesn't pick up on it. And then things keep going, right? There's a lot of things where something is happening that isn't necessarily malicious from the other person involved in the scene. And those are really traumatic, right? Just because there isn't intent to harm doesn't mean that harm doesn't happen. And I think that that's really important to talk about. And then the other piece is consent violations, right? Where somebody understands the expectations of them, understands the boundaries, and is acting unethically and ignoring those things, or overstepping their bounds, or bringing in behaviors that weren't agreed upon. And so I think both of those things have really serious impacts in kink on the people involved, and both cause a lot of harm and can be really different in the aftermaths. So, I think it's helpful to talk about kind of all aspects of when harm happens and what it looks like afterwards.
I know for my friend who went through this, there was a lot of guilt and shame
Yeah.
related to their particular kink trauma. In their case, it was definitely some consent violations and a toxic dynamic. And there's always those feelings of, how did I not realize? How did I get myself into this position?
How did I let that happen?
How did I let that happen?
Sure.
And what do you say to somebody who feels that way?
I would say, first of all, this is not your fault at all, right? I mean, I think we see this in all kinds of dynamics, right? In and out of kink spaces, right? We see it in individual relationships. We see it in like high control religions, right? Where you look at people and you're like, well, how did they get to that place where they were following that person and, maybe compromising their own values, or, outside of that dynamic, they would have looked in and said, well, that's not me. That's not something I would do. And that happens in so many different ways. And it's not the person's fault inside of it, because they tend to happen in kind of a snowball way, right? There's a tiny, tiny drip at first. And it's just a little thing, and it's it's an easy thing to ignore. And then maybe that thing is a little bit bigger down the line. And right, we all start figuring out ways with in a relationship with another human where neither of us is perfect, right? We all have times where we're like, hey, where is my flexibility around this? Where is my slide? How comfortable am I sliding to kind of one side or the other? And sometimes that slide is really understandable, right? There are always ways that we look at something maybe our partner wants to do and we're like, that's not necessarily something I would choose in a vacuum, but I'm going to show up and do this with them. And sometimes that's great. And sometimes it's like, oh, maybe that's a little further than I would have gone. And then next time, maybe it's a little further. And then next time, maybe it's a little further. And that's not anyone's, that's not anyone's fault. It's just something that happens, especially when we're in a relationship with somebody like we care about, and we hope they care about us. And as that kind of trust grows and builds, and potentially coercive behaviors grows and builds, right? Things like cutting people off from a social network or family or friends, especially in any kind of power exchange relationships, right? DS, MS relationships, OP relationships, anything like that, where you are consensually handing over some sort of power or authority to your person. There are a lot of ways that that can grow and snowball, and we might have not noticed it, right? We might kind of wake up one day and be like, holy shit, they have control over my finances. Like, that wasn't something that I kind of set out to do. And now we're in this place, and it's much harder to walk things back. It is always harder to put a boundary in versus having a boundary there in the first place, especially if that boundary maybe was kind of there in the first place and got ignored.
Yeah, I see a lot of newbies, let's say young, new, female
Impressionable.
identifying, impressionable, submissives, who I hear from them a lot. Well, I'm new, my dom is experienced, and so they're telling me this is normal, this is how the dynamic should be, this is how the relationship should be. And I'm just sitting there going, no, no, it isn't.
Yeah. I always tell folks like your gut is a real thing, right? Like mine certainly got ignored enough when I was in my salad days of kink. And I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of good choices. Somehow I emerged somewhat unscathed. I think I always try to encourage folks to seek as many educational sources as they can, and to listen to their gut, and to remember that, like, if something wouldn't fly in another relationship, it shouldn't fly in a kink one, right? Within the realm,
Amen.
especially within the realm of like agreement, right? Like if somebody slaps you across the face in a kink scene and you've agreed to it, it's great. It's so much fun. If somebody slaps you across the face in a kink scene and you haven't agreed to it, not so much fun. And if somebody slapped you across the face in a non-kink sexual encounter, you'd be like, what the fuck? So, I think a lot of times we tend to like throw out some of our non-kink relationship like yardstick. And it's okay to kind of bring that yardstick back in and be like, hey, are these things, measuring up in what I would look at as like a healthy, functional, communicative, non-kink relationship?
Yeah, trusting your gut is so important.
Mhm.
My thing I always tell people is, if you have to ask, "Is this normal?" You already know the answer.
You're questioning it already.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
you already
not-
know it's not. Your gut is telling you, which is now why you're at the point of asking the question.
Yeah.
We see this a lot on Reddit posts.
Yeah,
Oh, Reddit
I see
scares
I
me.
see that.
I'm scared.
Yes.
Well, I see it a lot in,
I'm
let's say, people who
86.
aren't necessarily out and about in a kink community,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they don't have other examples to look at and go, wait a minute, I'm watching them over there, and that looks nothing like what I'm doing.
Yeah. And
So there's no comparison.
and I think, in the rise of social media, oh my God, I sound like, a 90-year-old. In the rise of social media, these
Back in my day.
these days,
You got to sound a little more crotchety when you say that.
in the rise of social media. But realistically, like, vetting educational sources has gotten so much harder, right? Like, you used to be able to go to, yeah, I heard that little like,
I'm laughing because our next episode we're going to be recording is about how TikTok specifically
yeah.
has affected
Can I come on
kink
that one?
education and whether it's good or bad. So yes.
Oh my God, I have so many soapboxes.
Come
You sound just
on,
like Cara.
join me on them.
We're
I
gonna have
have
to build you guys twin
I
soapboxes.
have really big ones. There's
I
room
have-
for multiple people up here with me.
on the top of a tower of very precarious soapboxes. But, and we just saw this, recently with somebody who was really big on social media about kink and E&M. All of these accusations just came out, and a lot of people who are in the lifestyle day to day and involved in the community had never heard of him. And I think TikTok, Instagram, right, all of these platforms have given a lot of people who know how to present something well and who have just enough knowledge to be dangerous, a platform to say, hey, this is how to do it. This is, the way that it should be. And unfortunately, we've seen multiple times now and in the past, somebody who manages to kind of capture that market of like newcomers who who want more knowledge and are maybe a little bit nervous, don't know how to connect to their local community. Maybe, I mean, it's intimidating to like walk into a kink space when you don't know anyone, especially if you're young or new or all of those things. And a lot of these folks manage to kind of get themselves into that space before people are able to access, their wider community or more branches of knowledge, and they can really do some harm, and that's really, it's sad. I hate that people are able to take advantage of our community like that, and that it potentially cuts people off from being able to access the absolutely like amazing pieces of their community.
Yeah, that's kind so one of the problems is then something has happened to you
Hmm.
in a bad experience. How do you identify that you're ready to come back to kink?
I think for a lot of folks, just again, kind of going with their gut and thinking about when their thoughts start to turn to kink in general, maybe, right? Maybe it's something that kind of makes you pull back from kink as a whole, or maybe it's one particular type of play or type of interaction, right? And you've decided to continue kink in some way, but put a pause on that for a little while. I think a lot of times as people are going through this process, they're recognizing that when their thoughts turn to engaging in that they're noticing a lot of negative symptoms, right? Symptoms being anxiety, maybe their body starts having things like their heart beats faster, they start getting clammy hands, right? They're starting to have some sort of negative physical response. And a lot of times over time, or kind of working through things or working with a therapist or getting support from friends, right? Those things will start to lessen as you start to think about engaging in that. Right. So a lot of times early on, if you think about, doing a particular type of scene, you might be like, oh, I'm having a really strong response to that. 6 months later, a year later, you might be like, oh, I'm able to kind of think about doing that, and I'm not having a response, or not as strong a response, or maybe that response is a little more kind of outweighed by interest or some curiosity about what it would look like to get back in. And I think that's a time where it's really important to listen to yourself, right? And really check in with yourself and say, when I start thinking about this, when I start being curious about engaging with it, even just in like the thought realm, right? What is my body telling me? What are my emotions telling me? What is my thought process telling me? And that's a pretty internal process, right? That's something that you can kind of internally judge and clock for yourself. And then, right, if you have the opportunity to start trying it again, right? Let's say, for instance, maybe somebody had a bad experience in rope and they've reached the point where they're like, you know what? My curiosity and my desire are now feeling a bit weightier than maybe the anxiety that I have about potentially trying it again. I wonder what it would feel like to do some rope on myself and see how I do when I just start feeling the sensation again. When I just start sitting with that process again, when I feel, something get tight around my skin. And I think that can be another kind of way of dipping your toe in, right? I definitely wouldn't suggest jumping right back into whatever happened, but thinking about how can I go really slowly and incrementally, right? First the internal, then the external on a very small and safe and potentially even personal scale.
Is there any particular signs that would tell someone that maybe they're not ready yet to reemerge back into kink?
Yeah. So I am a really big advocate of folks listening to your body, especially. Sometimes our body like knows things before our heads get there,
Mhm.
right? You may have experienced this where you're in some sort of situation and all of a sudden you're starting to feel like anxious or upset, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, maybe my chest has been tight for a little while. Maybe my hands have been clammy for a little while." maybe there are these kind of physical things happening that I didn't recognize until my brain like caught up with them. But so a lot of times, if we can kind of work backwards and start recognizing those experiences in our body and what our body is doing and telling us, that can be a really helpful tool. So again, right, if you start to do these things, right, maybe you've kind of reached a place internally where you're like, hey, I think I would like to start trying this again. And you start going slowly and you notice, once we kind of reach a certain point, I'm starting to feel like my chest is really tight. My breath is getting shallow. Maybe I'm feeling tense. Maybe it's harder for me to kind of move in the way or connect to my body in the way that I'm used to. Your partner may be able to see things, right? There are kind of things to look for as your body starts to move from a like grounded state into a heightened state. Physiological responses. My favorite is the hands clammy. That's just like one thing that happens as your body starts to move into like an elevated state, right? And your sympathetic nervous system starts to kick in, right? And you go into that maybe fight or flight mode. But so thinking about those things, thinking about how do I check in? What are the things I recognize in myself, right? One person's anxiety might live in their chest and somebody else's might live in their jaw, and they get tight in their jaw. So thinking about like, what are the signs for myself and how do I check in on those? And that might be sharing it with the person you're trying things with so that they can help you check in, right? They can say, how are you doing? How are you doing with breathing? How's your jaw, right? Do you feel like you're clenching your jaw? They can kind of help monitor these things for you or help remind you what to check in for. And taking it slow enough, right? Giving yourself the gift of taking things slow enough that if you notice that you first have time to notice those things. And when you do notice those things, you are able to intervene, because that's where these skills really kind of come in handy, right? Is that when you notice them early on enough that you're able to be in a place where you can bring them down, where you can say, hey, we need to stop this. I need to take a moment to like reground myself. And then we can figure out what that means from there, right? Whether that's maybe engaging again in a different way or slower or just going to that point again, because that was kind of the upper limit of what felt safe. Whether it was saying, hey, let's transition to something else entirely, something that does feel good, that does feel safe, that does feel really positive. But allowing yourself space and time to recognize those things and give yourself time to kind of take the off ramp.
Yeah, one of the things that I know is at least that works for me, not that I've ever had any of this kind of trauma, is though when things do go wrong, I'm very good about sitting down and kind of going over it and seeing that even though it's not necessarily my fault, there's still things I could have done differently. How could somebody incorporate like that kind of a healing process to maybe, I don't want to say necessarily turn the whole thing into a positive experience, but turn it into a learning experience,
Sure.
which I guess when you learn from something that is positive, but still.
Yeah. So I think right when I talked before about kind of the idea of like a consent accident, that's a lot of times the experience that somebody has after a consent accident, right? Where it wasn't they recognized that it wasn't necessarily malicious on the part of the other person, but they still recognize that real harm has happened. And I think the first piece of that is just acknowledging and validating that like that harm was real. Like the things that you experienced, regardless of everything leading up to them or the intent behind them or anything else, that was a real damaging potentially or harmful experience. And so just validating that for yourself is really important. And then afterwards, kind of thinking about, okay, where did things go sideways, right? Maybe it was an accident that was kind of just a complete fluke, that like there was nothing that could have prevented it. And so thinking about like, well, what safety practices does that mean that I want? Does that mean that this is now out of my risk profile? If you recognize there was potentially a communication piece, maybe a negotiation piece, maybe how you communicate internally in a scene that might have impacted it, potentially prevented it, potentially like, lessened the impact of it, whatever that means. That's something where you can think back and kind of think about, how do I want to incorporate this into either my knowledge of myself, my negotiation practices, my in-scene practices, right? So for instance, I go very nonverbal in a scene. So I know if something goes wrong, it's very rare that I can access the actual language to say what is happening. So, right, that means that we back up and we say, okay, well, what are going to give us, what's going to give us the opportunity for that to be addressed mid-scene, versus like when we're finished with the scene and coming down, I'm like, oh, I really wanted to stop that thing, but like, I didn't have the language, or I couldn't access my language to say it. Another tool that I think can be really helpful in the new topping and new bottoming books, which are fantastic. Janet Hardy and Dossie Eason, I love them. Their books are really, really helpful for folks who are frankly new and have been doing this for a while. So they have what they call the rights and responsibilities list. And I think that can be a really helpful framework, because it does kind of create a collaborative atmosphere. So for instance, as both a bottom and a top, you might say, hey, I have the right to have my boundaries listened to and respected. And my responsibility to that is that I have the responsibility to communicate those. Right. So like, obviously that's a very simple explanation or example. But I think that can be a really helpful framework to kind of branch out with. And they have, more nuanced examples in their book. That I think can be a helpful way of balancing and kind of trying to find that middle ground between self-blame, realistically, right? Of like, I could have spoken up, I could have said something, I could have made this clear beforehand, I could have been clear, right? Like there are lots of those thoughts that come realistically. And those are potentially really painful and really harmful to think about. And, being able to kind of move those into a space of like, going forward, what do I want to change in terms of my practices? What do I think I can do to have, to have kind of bumpers or a little cushioning in place? And then in response to that, what do I have the right to expect from somebody I'm scening with or playing with, or, in a partnership with, right? What does that kind of give and take look like? If I show up and expect these things, what is my responsibility to show up and communicate? Realistically, those are things that can be really empowering. And I also encourage folks to really sit and hold that sometimes two things can be true, right? Like, that shouldn't have happened to you, and it can be really harmful. And there might be things that you can do in the future to, have a different kind of agency around it. And both of those things can be true.
I love it. I happened to just teach last night my mastering bottoming class.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things I harp on in that class is that your responsibility as the bottom to communicate and to tell your partner and be honest with them, and not fudge the truth because you're worried about hurting their feelings, or you're worried that they'll end the scene early if you're not being honest with them, because when you're not honest with them is when things often tend to go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I also teach your scene went wrong, now what do you do class. And one of the things I talk about is the debriefing you have to do after things have gone wrong. Now, obviously, if this was a case, and I love the distinction between consent accidents and consent violations, because intent is important, but not for consent violations, because that's different. But when there's a consent accident, the debriefing where you sit down with your partner, whether it's immediately after or a week after, because you need time to process, to talk about what went wrong, how did it happen, where could we have fixed it, either one of us or both of us, so that it happens again. I mean, even when I'm topping, I want to know these things so I don't make the same mistakes again.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you guys give an example of a consent accident?
Oh, I can. I
Sure.
can. It's the one that you call it a violation. I like the
Yeah.
consent
I'd
accident.
like your opinion on this one,
Well,
AJ.
okay. Oh dear. Before we do that, I just want to like really quickly name, like, I also really appreciate that distinction. it was certainly not my invention. And right, this is another place where like two things can be true. That's a really helpful framework. And the person who kind of popularized that framework, has it been embroiled in their own consent accusations and things like that. So I just wanted to name that, because we can have two things that are true,
Yeah.
right? This can be a really
Bad
helpful
bad
framework.
people who do bad things can still have smart ideas about other things.
So in a broad term, not specifically, I would lump consent accident, in the realm of, was a boundary unclear, was something not communicated, whether it's in scene, whether it's in negotiation, did something go wrong, right? That was kind of out of both people's hands, that there wasn't necessarily a way to foresee, or that maybe a safety practice wasn't put in place. Those are things that are more in kind of the accident realm, where they are they're potentially avoidable, but not necessarily malicious. And then consent violation would be more like, did somebody intentionally do something unsafe, knowing there are better safety practices? Did somebody understand and have good consent practices and know that they were ignoring those? Did somebody have knowledge of a boundary and step over that line? Right? Those are things where there's intent behind it.
I'm laughing
I am
just
so
because
curious. The look.
I think even you have already started to convince her. So I had negotiated an impact scene with somebody.
Mhm.
And this was in my early days when, yes, my negotiation skills needed a lot of improvement.
Sure.
But at the time, I thought I was doing well. We negotiated an impact scene. Nothing was ever discussed about sexual aspects to this scene.
Mhm.
I mistakenly made the assumption if I didn't mention it, it's not going to happen.
Mhm.
He made the assumption I didn't say no to that. So it's
On the table.
It's on the table.
Mhm.
And he went and got a Hitachi to use on me. Now, the minute I said, "No, thank you, I don't want that," he went, "Oh, okay," and he put it away,
Mhm.
right? And he reached out to me the next day and apologized, and we talked about it, and we each walked away having learned the same very valuable lesson of how to better negotiate
Mhm.
things. To which now I advise everybody to add one sentence to your negotiations, which is, if I haven't said yes to something specifically, then you have to assume the answer to that is no.
Mhm.
And that way I make sure if I forgot to talk about something, you already know it's off the table.
And see, my perspective of that is that should be that should be common knowledge. Like, you should know, if you in kink specifically, one of the rules is the whole consent thing, right? If I haven't said yes, it is automatically no. Like, that's something I feel like everybody should know going in, and like, that's duh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, realistically, I think that had that happened today, we would probably look at it pretty differently. Right? It sounds like this was an experience that happened a fair while ago.
About
7
about
years,
about
7 or
8
8.
years,
Yeah.
about 8 years ago.
Yeah. I mean,
Maybe even 9. Yeah.
even when we think about like kind of our understanding, or like the general consent landscape, right? Certainly the kink community had a much better, more nuanced conversation and understanding of consent, in general then. But our views on consent were often pretty different, even, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And so, like, a lot of times looking back on things, right? I had many experiences like that, where it was like, hey, something that we didn't talk about, were kind of brought in, and we communicated about them like in scene. And that's not what I would necessarily expect or advise anyone to do right now. But a lot of times that was kind of much more the norm at the time. And I'm like, for me, I'm talking, like probably, oh my God, like almost 20 years ago. God, I've been doing this a really long time.
Since you were very 18.
18,
So,
exactly. The minute I turned 18.
In which case, it's still only been 10 years, right?
Not almost 20. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
because time.
But I mean, in kind of when I was doing this in my like late teens, early 20s, That was something that was, I would say, much more common. And now that is something that is hopefully less common. We have a stronger understanding of how we negotiate, and that in scene, there are very real kind of barriers, like literal physiological barriers to why we don't make great decisions, or why we shouldn't do kind of in scene negotiations. And I think, then I also wasn't hearing as much about kind of how we approach negotiations. And right now that seems like it's a gap between how each of you were approaching negotiations, where, you were coming from a much more inclusive style, which is, what we talk about are the only things we're including, right? So like, you can use these three implements here, here, and here, and that's the only thing that is happening, right? That's kind of an inclusive style. And he was coming from an exclusive style, which is, tell me the boundaries. You can't do this, this, and this, and you can't hit here, here, and here. And then, right, like the rest of the things within reason, right, are on the table. Like, you can't whip out a chainsaw because that's not part of a general impact play scene.
Yeah.
But, right, but you might,
No.
grab a giant fish from the freezer. I don't know.
Okay,
This
that
is
would
my
be
go-to.
funny.
Okay, that I'd be upset about because I have a seafood allergy. I'd
Oh,
be
yeah.
more upset about that than the damn Hitachi
What-
being
what
pulled
if it
out.
was like a
So there
rubber
we go.
mackerel?
That's
Okay, if it's rubber, that's fine.
that. But like, for instance, that's potentially a really good example of like the potential higher risk of an exclusive negotiation, right? Is that you do leave a lot more things open. You might say, hey, I really like thuddy things, and you can hit me, here, here, and here. And you might not know that they like think it would be really funny that they have like a whole fish in the next room, and they think it would be really funny to like go and grab it and hit you with it because, it's thuddy. It's going to be funny. You're doing this impact scene. You're kind of, it's like a fun, silly vibe. And right, that's something where like, you wouldn't necessarily tell an impact partner who you were just scening with that I have a fish allergy.
No, you're right, because like you wouldn't think that would come up. That's
Right.
not a medical condition that you would normally see as being an issue.
Right. So like,
She's shopping for
for
rubber
yes,
fish
incredible.
to hit me with.
Do it.
Okay, so I'll be hit with a rubber fish if it's pink.
I actually just found bait lures. You know
Oh,
how
yeah.
they're like all squishy and
Oh,
stuff?
yeah.
I want to grab a whole bunch of these and make like a flogger
Incredible.
to hit her with, and they're fish. So we can call it her aquarium flogger.
There we go. Yeah, I guess for me, what it really came down to in this particular instance was two things: intent
Mhm.
and the way he handled it.
Yeah.
That when I said no, immediately there was no argument, there was no discussion. Went okay, and it got put away.
Mhm.
And that he called me the next day to apologize again.
Yeah.
And to discuss it so that he could learn and do better.
Yeah.
I'll give them credit for that. I just think they were stupid.
I mean,
Okay,
yeah.
stupid and consent. It has those are two separate issues.
It was not great consent practices, realistically, but it also, right, I think intent does have an impact. And I think the other side of this is that consent accidents often do have a two-way impact, right? If somebody is trying to act and engage as ethically as possible, and they are genuinely showing up, trying to do their best, and they might, that might mean that they don't necessarily have the tools, right? We don't know what we don't know sometimes. It might mean that something gets missed in negotiations through no kind of intent of either party. And a bottom can still be really harmed and walk away from a scene having a really potentially traumatic experience. And the tough thing about that is that the top in that situation can also have a really significant amount of harm, right? If you want to go about this in a positive and ethical and kind of upstanding manner, and you recognize, shit, I just really harmed someone. I just really did some damage that I didn't intend to. That is also really painful and potentially really traumatic. And, I think that adds a lot of complication to a lot of this, because ultimately the bottom usually was the person who was harmed. And I say usually because realistically, right, tops also have boundaries and limits and can have their consent violated. But more often in what we're talking about, right, the bottom is the person who's experienced the kind of the violation, or the consent incident. But a complicated piece to this is that the tops in those scenarios also often are dealing with a lot of like really complicated feelings and potentially a lot of anxiety and fear and trepidation about engaging with those things themselves again. So I think a lot of times you do have these kind of experiences on both sides of the slash, and sometimes that means that those people can heal and kind of do some repair together, and sometimes that also means that they need their own process. The bottom might say, hey, I don't really want you to be involved in this. Like, I need you to acknowledge the harm. But beyond that, I want to kind of do this process myself. Or the top might say that. And that can be potentially even more impactful or adding to the harm. So I think that the next steps and the kind of fallout, if you will, is also something to talk about and to kind of navigate very carefully, because that's really a fragile period where things can either be compounded or start to be repaired.
I've seen that in action. I had a partner who was the top in a fire cupping scene
Mhm.
that went wrong,
Yep.
and the bottom ended up with second and third degree burns.
Mhm.
And I mean, I know that the bottom was obviously messed up, but I got to see firsthand what it did to the top
Mhm.
and how it messed them up and the struggle they went through and the grief that they went through, and the fact that they kept apologizing. They were trying to talk to the bottom, but the bottom, and valid, was like, fine, I accept your apology, but you heal over there and I'm healing over here.
Mhm.
And as far as I know to this day, like, and this is a good 5 years later, they've never done fire cupping since. Like, they could
Mhm.
never go back to
Have
it.
they seen
Th
since
they've
then?
seened, and I know they went back to fire, not cupping, but the cups with the suction
Mhm.
instead
Mm.
of fire because they were petrified. Also my rope top who
I
had
was just gonna bring that
who
up.
had a scene where equipment malfunction, not the rope's fault,
Mhm.
the rope top's fault. It was, literally the hard point fell out of the ceiling in a
It
suspension
it
scene.
wasn't anchored as well, I guess, as everybody thought, or there was too much wear and tear on it at that point,
Yeah.
and it literally fell. Unfortunately, the person who she had tied at the time was upside down.
I mean, the good news is that person was not seriously hurt. They
No.
just had bumps, bruises, and soreness.
Yeah.
But I watched the rope top go through this healing process, feeling guilt. There was a time where they were really struggling because we were super close. Like, we were chosen family close. And I was their normal rope bottom. And I just happened to not go to that party.
Mhm.
Had I been at that party, the odds were great that I would have been the one in the rope
Mhm.
who fell. So now they're dealing with oh my God, that could have been you. Right? There was so much guilt. It took
A
a long
long time.
time to get her ready to tie again. And it was very specific what we had to go through the process. Like, she tied with me because she knew she could trust me implicitly to be open and honest if there were issues. We tied in my dungeon where the rope top, was the one who had put in that hard point.
Mhm.
So she had 100% comfort in that. And it was a very simple, easy tie until we could finally work her back up to it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I've seen the tops dealing with the trauma of mistakes
Yeah.
I think
that
she
some were not even their fault. They just
Mhm.
yeah.
shit happens.
Yeah. As a side note resource, resource corner. There's a website called Crash Restraint that has a few articles on hardpoint evaluation that are really technical and well done. So they talk about the types of hardware themselves, how and where to kind of evaluate the anchoring point. Because a lot of times, right, and you see like on the internet all the time where they're like, look, I hid this hard point under a smoke detector. And you're like, that, I bet you anything, is not a safe hard point. So a lot of times people will try to sink hard points into, their own homes or things like that. And that can be a potentially very dangerous thing. And so there's that, like, that's just a really helpful resource about how to look at and evaluate, make hard points.
Yeah, and her healing took a little bit longer because the host sort of kept them out of the process
Mm,
of finding out how it happened in the first place. And this particular top had really wanted to be a part of it because they wanted to learn.
hmm
So they knew what to look for.
hmm
Because up until that point, their ties had pretty much been done at dungeons, or, as I said, in my dungeon, where they were responsible for putting the hard point in, and therefore they felt confident how it was done and done right.
Yeah.
And they were prevented from like really being a part of that whole, debriefing on what went wrong,
Yeah.
which also impacted their ability to heal.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, is figuring out like what does, at the very least kind of doing data gathering, right? Of what do people kind of need in terms of their own space, their own knowledge, their own interactions in this debriefing period. That doesn't necessarily mean that those are all going to be met 100%, because they might rub up against each other, right? There might be places where one person says, hey, I want you to be extremely involved in the debrief or the after action, if you will, piece of this. And the other person says, that's not something I can do, right? So those things might have friction. But if you have that knowledge and that understanding, and everybody's kind of putting out there and saying, hey, these are my needs, that potentially gives people more options and maneuvering to figure out how are we going to make this kind of the most effective process for everyone, and hopefully helping people find solid footing again, and feeling like they are able to move forward, and they are able to kind of access the repair that they need.
So I want to talk a little bit now about if you're the partner of somebody who experienced the trauma
Yeah.
and you weren't part of the trauma. You either were their partner at the time it happened with somebody else, or you've now their partner later after it. Like, what can you do as the partner to help support them, to help them learn to trust you and move forward?
So right earlier when we were talking about potentially this period of guilt and feeling like, oh, I could have done something differently, and I mentioned that it's incredibly important during that piece to validate that harm was very real. That's where a partner can be extremely supportive right off the bat, right? Is just saying like the things that potentially might have been able to be different leading up to this, we can talk about those down the line, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that like this was really harmful, that you experienced something that was really traumatic, or that was really painful, or that was really, you know, life disrupting potentially. And being able to kind of be a person who's just validating that, because a lot of times, especially if those thought processes start around guilt or, could I have mitigated this? What those do is they often kind of push out our feeling that we have, like, quote unquote, the right to feel harmed or to be upset or to validate our own experience. And so being able to show up as a partner and say, yeah, that was harmful. Like, you did experience something, and you're allowed to take the space and time to recognize the impact on you. That's a really powerful thing to kind of give permission, right? Quote unquote, give permission to
Mhm.
someone to do, and creating that. And I think as a partner, a lot of times we really want to fix things. Like, it's so painful to see our partner in a distressed state that we have this really strong urge to jump in and be like, how can we fix this? How can we set you up for, having a more successful interaction next time? How can we learn from this? How can we kind of move that process forward? They are often also doing that because sometimes it's really painful or, difficult to sit in that grief and pain and feelings of distress that come after an incident. And if you are able to kind of give them that space and help create that space for them and not push that process forward too fast, kind of follow their lead a bit, that's really helpful. That can also, a lot of times, if a partner kind of starts moving towards, right, and I obviously, the caveat to all of this is that everybody is different, but a lot of times if a partner starts kind of focusing on what's next, what did we learn from this, all of those things, it can sometimes make the person who has experienced harm focus more on the part that they played in that, and can kind of impact and compound the feelings or the thoughts of like self-blame. So really creating that space for validation, and then in the future, once the person who's experienced harm says, hey, I want to kind of start moving into a space of learning from this or figuring out what to do differently next time, then going along with them for that. But so resisting that really strong and really like compassionate impulse to jump in and like fix.
The person who inspired this and suggested this episode, they were slowly working back to impact.
Mhm.
And they were able to come to my dungeon, just the two of us, and do an impact scene, because it was totally different than what had happened to them last time. First of all, they were in a big party setting, male top. We made it a very lighthearted, fun session. We were able to get like through 2 or 3 of those and do very well. They decided to try a scene at the public dungeon with their new partner, who is amazing and wonderful and sweet and kind. And she trusted him implicitly, but trying it again back in a public setting triggered her.
Mhm.
Needless to say, scene stopped. She called Red. He stopped immediately. He had done everything right.
Mhm.
But now she's off in a corner crying, and she's got the triggering. Now she's feeling guilt that she upset her current partner. The current partner is upset because he's like, oh my God, I triggered her. Like, what would you advise the two of them in a situation like that so that they could get past that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think in a situation like that, it's really important to kind of go into triage mode, right? Of like what needs to be addressed first. And in that moment, more often than not, getting people kind of back down to a grounded state is the most important, because when we are elevated, right? When we're in that fight flight mode, when our sympathetic nervous system has kicked in, and that's telling us like we're in this hyper aroused state, it's telling us you are potentially in danger, right? Because our bodies haven't evolved and our brains haven't evolved as quickly as our, cultures and societies have. So it is still very much in this like you are in danger, something, has activated that. We are not equipped to make great decisions or to think rationally or to have like our relational ability, our ability to like listen to each other and connect with each other, it goes down in those moments. So in those moments, getting down to a more grounded state where there's a sense of safety back, where we're able to kind of bring our like relational brain back online, that's just the first thing that's going to create any sort of impact. And that can look different from everyone for everyone. A lot of times that's where grounding exercises like breathing, the 5 senses exercise, all of those can really come in handy. But that's kind of the first thing that often needs to happen, because it's laying the groundwork for anything that will potentially come afterwards. I would say probably fairly often the top is in a more advantageous state to kind of lead that, because the bottom may have been more activated or more elevated, or who I would say maybe not necessarily top and bottom, but whoever is not triggered is in a more advantageous state to lead that process. So as much as possible, being able to kind of jump in and say, like, let's work together, let's ground these things. I think this is also where it can become really important in negotiations to have a contingency plan, right? Of like, if things do, because it's great to plan aftercare, please negotiate your aftercare, advocate for what you need. But regardless of the scene, and if you are potentially trying something that you know might be activating or triggering, I think it's really helpful to have some sort of like emergency plan, right? If something goes sideways, if somebody calls a safe word, if something goes wrong, what does that look like? Here's our plan. We're going to, go to this area of the dungeon. We're going to do these exercises to ground ourselves. We're going to, maybe find this friend who might be there, who we know we both feel safe with, or who you feel safe with, to help do that process, right? Like, so having that set up in advance can also just make it more accessible, because then nobody's trying to do that triage process and figure out what everybody needs in the moment while they're also activated and having this experience. So I think that can be really helpful. Beyond that, right, continuing to kind of do this process of thinking about how can I remove as many variables as possible. I think that's really important. And I refer to it as, so that I teach a class about engaging in masochism after a history of self-harm. Actually, I think that, was I here? Did I do that episode?
We did healthy hurting.
Oh yeah.
I think we did.
I was like, deja vu. Yeah. And so I think a lot
It was something.
something. A lot of times, like a similar process, right? When you're potentially nervous about engaging in something, I always tell people to give yourself clean data, right? So remove as many factors as possible. So I think it sounds like what the two of you did, removing as many unknowns or as many kind of potential factors as possible, just the two of you in a safe environment with all the quantities being known quantities, was a really helpful thing. And then it sounds like there were a lot of things kind of added back in. And so maybe allowing the process to happen again, and maybe for the two of them to then be able to scene together in your space, right? Where one thing is being added back in at a time. So you know that your space feels safe, it feels known, and so then bringing the new partner into that space so that feels like that is a known quantity now. And then, right, even doing a smaller party, a house party, even just like, having some friends around while you do a impact scene, giving yourself very, very as small of increments as you can. Again, right, if we think back to giving ourselves lots of kind of off ramps, the time and space to intervene at every point that we can, to check in and potentially intervene or come back down or pause, as small as you can make those increments at first, gives you, I don't want to necessarily say a better chance of success, but I think a better chance of not compounding the harm, maybe.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because that's sort of exactly what happened. Is that night at the dungeon, they were there. There was a whole bunch of us,
Mhm.
and we sort of split up oddly by gender of all things. And so the women all went to her to make sure she was okay and help her, and the men took care of the top and made sure he was okay. I ended up talking to both of them. Like, we reassured her she did nothing wrong. She shouldn't feel guilt. If anything, she should be proud of her partner and feel safe because she read it and he stopped and did everything she needed him to do. And she shouldn't feel guilty that she was triggered by all this. And then we went and told him, you did everything right. You handled it the best you could. Like, nobody should feel they did anything wrong in
And
this situation.
yeah, and I think, I think that it's worth remembering that, like, creating a collaborative atmosphere and a safe enough atmosphere where somebody does feel safe to call red is not an insignificant piece of all of this, right? That often takes a certain amount of safety and trust to even say, hey, I can speak up because I feel safe enough to, and I know it's going to be listened to, right? That's a a really important kind of foundational piece that I think can be really helpful when you are kind of rebuilding trust or kind of doing that repair.
And they were able to do a scene in my dungeon at a very small party so that not only so they were in a small environment, it wasn't a public dungeon, and she was surrounded by others that she trusted implicitly, and not that she didn't trust her top two, but just having that extra safety net.
That's
So
great. Yeah.
we could go on and on about all of this because it's such an amazing topic, and I personally know so many people who have dealt with
Mm-hmm.
some different levels of trauma. But I just kind of want to give you an opportunity to give any final advice that you might have for somebody who's apprehensive but eager to return to kink activities after a trauma.
Oh my goodness. No pressure.
No pressure.
I would really return to thinking about how or what it looks like to check in with yourself, right? What's the rubric that lets you know that you're doing okay, right? What are you looking for in your body? What are you looking for in your thought patterns? What are you looking for in kind of the thoughts that are coming to you? So it might be that, you're feeling pretty okay in your body, but you're noticing maybe a little tightness in your chest. And you also notice that like the thoughts that are happening are starting to be, you're going to fuck this up. You're not going to do something right. And maybe you're like, that doesn't feel like a place where I want to come from when I'm starting to engage in this again. Giving yourself an understanding of like, what do I want this to look like for me internally and externally? And that can take some time, and it can take some exploration, whether that's with, educational content, whether it's online, through a podcast, through books, again, like the New Topping and New Bottoming book, I really love as a resource. And, talking with partners, leaning on the people around you for support, having a support system through the community can be really, really beneficial. If you have a kink aware therapist and a trauma informed therapist, that can be a really great space to process that and think about your needs. So really kind of sitting with that and thinking about what's the context that I need and how can I set that up for myself to feel like I have kind of cushions or some safety barriers in place. And then the second piece of that is breaking things down to kind of as small of steps as possible and giving yourself, again, kind of that idea of like clean data. What's one factor that I can add in? Okay, what's the next small factor that I can add in? Okay, what's the next small factor? And sometimes that can realistically be frustrating, and that's okay. I would rather people be frustrated by my advice than to jump back in and potentially have something feel harmful or re-traumatizing. So I'm sorry. My advice is frustrate yourself a little bit, edge yourself a little bit. But realistically, like I this is a mistake that I have made, right? Where I've felt ready to do something again, and I've gone faster than I probably would now or would have advised myself then, and it didn't go great for me. And so that made the process kind of start all over again. And I look back at that now and I'm like, yeah, I did what I thought I wanted to do at the time, and that was fine, right? I was a very different person. And when it's happened since, or when other things have happened since, going slowly, even when it has felt maybe a little frustrating, has ultimately served me better. And again, that is speaking from my experience, right? This is not a one size fits all game, but listening to yourself and thinking about the rubric that you need, and then giving yourself time and space to go slowly so that you can put that rubric into place and you can use it at each increment, is probably the biggest kind of very large nebulous piece of advice that I would have for folks.
Well, this has been amazing and wonderful, and it is always a delight to talk to you. You have so much great information.
Okay.
Where can people find you?
Oh God.
On the internet.
On the internet. Apparently you can Google my bio. But, I don't think that got recorded. Yeah, I was giving a shout out to all the event producers who leave their websites up so that I can find my own bio and copy and paste it into new things. But you can find me on the internet. My vet life is never used, but it's AJ, A-J. I tend not to add folks unless we have some sort of personal connection. But if you have met me at an event, please drop me a message. If you have any questions about this podcast or anything like that, or anything I talked about, right, about the podcast in general, I suggest you not talk to me, talk to them. But
More to the point, talk to Rara.
okay. But if you have any questions or are looking for resources, right, I'm more than happy to help folks get connected with a kink aware therapist, right? That is obviously my job. If I've met folks kind of through events or things like that, I tend to refer them to other people versus myself. But I'm happy to help people get connected with those resources. I'm happy to help people find, events or people in their community or places to go. I'm happy to talk about vetting educational sources and, kind of things to look for in that realm. And so, you can find me on FET. You can find me on Facebook as AJ Renard. Same thing. I tend not to friend people on those platforms who I haven't, had some sort of personal connection with, but I am always willing to message people on those platforms. You can also email me at fetlifeaj@gmail.com.
Perfect. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you again.
My pleasure.
Always fun to talk with you. So much good information.
I love being here. So thank you for having me again.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed what you heard, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a minute of our fun and educational content. New episodes drop every Friday.
If you love what we do and want to show support, there are several ways. Join us on Patreon at patreon.com/pinkkinkpodcast. You can support our affiliates or help spread the word about our kinky podcast to your friends.
Don't forget to rate and review Pink Kink on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Those 5-star reviews go a long way in boosting our podcast through the algorithm and reaching more listeners.
Sign up for our Pink Kink Institute classes. Shop at our Etsy shop, Pink Kink Boutique. Stay connected with us on social media. You'll find all the links on our link tree posted in the show notes.
Your support means the world to us. So until next time, stay pretty, stay safe,
and stay twisted.